Ask Alec.
Hey guys, what's up? And welcome to an episode of Ask Alec. Today's question comes from my boy Quincy. He writes into me. It says, hey man, I have a problem on playing deep stack poker, and I haven't seen much deep stack poker strategy for cash games on YouTube. It would be great if you could make a video on how to play 150 big blinds or more. So if you're playing 510, that means you have $1,500 or more on the table. He says, I seem to stack off light when I have big stacks, and I see people who buy in deep at the bigger game, and what makes these guys good and difficult to play against? So Quincy, great question, man. This is something, fortunately, I have a lot of experience with. I think my bread and butter, so to speak, is the high stakes deep stack live cash games. That's really my favorite format of poker. And that generally means most players at the table have 200 or 300 big blinds, or sometimes more. So a lot of the times in these games, there's a lot of adjustments you need to make, especially coming from tournament poker or online poker, where the average stack, in tournament poker could be something like 30, 40 big blinds. And in online poker, it's maybe 100, 150 big blinds at the most. But most of the time, you're playing 100 big blind poker. And frankly, you're playing like 6 max. So live deep stack no limit cash games are a totally different ball game, right? It's not even tantamount to something like playing tennis on different surfaces. It's almost like playing a different game entirely, because the hands that you want to play change dramatically. And I'll walk you through some of the differences in these different types of formats. This is something I talk a lot more about in my premier training products, the 4 Steps to Beating Anyone at Poker, which I highly encourage you to check out on alectorelli.com if you want like my full blueprint for how I make these adjustments. But for now, here's really what you need to know. So the first adjustment you want to think about is that people are looking to bust hands that people normally would stack off with in 100 big blind poker. And what I mean by that is when people play hands and they're calling raises or they're playing hands in position or whatever it is, they're in there with hands that play extremely well post flop and that can bust an overpair, so to speak. So if you're stacking off constantly with like one pair or an overpair or with 2 queens on a 10-7-5 board or whatever, you got to keep in mind that most of the time you get the money in on the flop, people are either going to have a monster draw or a set or 2 pair. And that's because people are playing with the mentality of hoping that the raiser has aces or kings and hoping that the raiser stacks off with those types of hands. So the hands that they're going to play are hands that play very well post-flop and that can stack these types of hands. And that's generally the correct strategy. So there's a huge difference between like ace-5 suited and let's say, a queen-high flush draw, like queen-10 suited, because the ace-high suited hand will bust the queen-high suited hand whenever they both make a flush or they both flop a huge draw. So you want to play hands as you get deeper. You want to use sort of like a sliding scale, and you want to play hands that are more and more likely to make the nuts. And it becomes more and more important that as your stack to pot ratio increases, in other words, as your chip stack increases relative to the pot or the size of the game, that the hands you're playing are more likely to make the nuts, so that you can be more confident in putting your money in post-flop when you make a big hand. Let me give you another example that's very, very common that I see in deep stack cash games where players make a lot of mistakes. So one of the things I see often is players playing hands like really, really small pairs, like deuces or whatever, for a raise or a re-raise in marginal situations. And the problem with this is, like, let's say you're 300 or 400 big blinds deep. It's great if you flop a set, and sure, you could win a decent sized pot off something like aces. Flops like 9-5 deuce or whatever, sure. But the problem is that when you put all your money in, you're 300-400 big blinds deep, it's really likely that someone's going to have a higher set. Because remember, people play hands to bust other people's hands. So a hand like 7s, 8s, or 9s goes up tremendously in value because those hands bust hands like 2s, 3s, and 4s and when they both flop set to set. And that's really how you're going to get all your money in when you're 300 or 400 big blinds deep. People, unless they're terribly bad or they're the big fish in the game or whatever, just aren't stacking off for 300 big blinds with a 1-pair type hand or even a bottom set type hand. Like, let's face it, if the flop's like 10-8 deuce in a raised pot and you have deuces and it's rainbow, if you put in 400 big blinds, you're hoping your opponent has 10-8. And like there's, maybe 2 combinations of 10-8 suited that you're hoping he has. Otherwise, he has a set. So it's like you can't even justify putting all your money in with these like mediocre hands when you're super deep. And that's why it's problematic to play those hands. So you have to use a sliding scale. And I'm going back to what I said originally is like if you're 150 big blinds deep or 200 big blinds deep, you could easily get the money in with bottom set because there's enough hands your opponent could have that are worse than yours. But as you get deeper and deeper, you have to get closer and closer to playing hands that only make the nuts because otherwise you're just going to get it in behind too often. The other thing that's really important as you get deeper, so we talked a little bit about hand values. The same thing is true for like suited connectors, pairs, etc. You want to play all hands that could beat other hands. The second thing that's really true in poker as you get deeper is the power of position, right? And that's because you're going to play bigger pots on later and subsequent streets, and it's more and more important that you're in position because good players are going to put you to really tough decisions for a lot of big blinds in tough spots. So if you're out of position against a good player and you're 50 big blinds deep, there's only so much they can do. But if you're 200, 250 big blinds deep, the problem is when you get to a difficult spot on the river where your range is obvious to him and it looks like you have a weak hand, he's just going to put you to a terrible decision, right? You're not going to know if he's bluffing or value betting you. And if he bets like 2x or 2.5x the pot, you're just in a pretty shitty spot, man, to be honest. So you don't want to put yourself in tough spots against good players when you're super deep by playing out of position. And that's extremely important as you get deeper because they have more and more leverage on you the deeper the stacks get. So position becomes extremely important. The other thing that's important, probably the third thing and the last thing, not the last thing, I talk about more about this in my other products, but like the last thing I have time for in this video is really protecting your range on different types of boards. So in 100 big blind poker or 50 big blind poker, you could just re-raise with all your strong hands and you don't have enough chips behind that your opponents can really do anything about it, right? Like even if, let's say you have 50 big blinds, okay? Let's say you're playing 5-10 and you have $500. It goes, raise to 30, call. You make it 160 pre-flop. Even if your opponent knows you have 2 kings, like what's he gonna do? He calls your 160 and you have 300 behind, you have a 1 pot size bet left, you're just gonna shove all in on any good flop, and he can't show a profit by calling to bust your hand pre-flop because it's just, even if it's obvious what you have, you don't have enough chips and the math doesn't add up, he's not gonna bust your hand often enough to compensate with his implied odds. But the problem is when you get super deep stacked, like let's say you have, the same example, but you have 3,000. Now it goes 30, 30, 30, you make it 160 or 180. If you're only re-raising with really, really strong hands and you're playing obvious, then your opponent's gonna call pre-flop and he's only gonna play a big pot post-flop if he could bust you. So it becomes really obvious how you're playing if you don't mix up your strategy, and your opponents are going to react very, very well to you, and they're actually going to show a profit calling with weak hands pre-flop because they have so much on the implied odds side to bust you post-flop. So it's important to make these adjustments by mixing up your game, and that means sometimes re-raising with weaker hands, sometimes calling raises with weaker hands, sometimes flat calling with strong hands. It just becomes more important to mix up your game so that your opponents can't put you on a specific hand. And that's just the general scope of the strategy that you want to apply. So you definitely want to do these 3 things. Play stronger hands that make the nuts, play more in position, and mix up your game when you're playing deep stack poker because it's really important that your opponents can't put you on a hand. The last sort of adjustment I would make is be more selective about what games you play in, because when you're really deep, if you are at a disadvantage because there's a great player on your left or you're just outmatched in a game, you're going to pay for those mistakes tenfold because you're just so much deeper. There's so much more room for the good players to win the most amount of money and have a bigger edge. So be more selective in the games you play and don't put yourself in tough spots against good players. That's the general bottom line. All right, man, Quincy, hope you enjoyed this video. If you guys like this, subscribe to my channel. You guys could shoot me questions on alectorelli.com. I'll take the best ones and feature them here in this channel. Hope you enjoyed today's episode of Ask Alec, and I'll see you guys next time. Take it easy.